Edward James Zakrzewski II killed his wife and their two young kids, then vanished and changed his name. But he couldn't hide forever. After spending decades on Florida's death row, he was finally executed. It all started at their home in Mary Esther, Florida. Edward and his wife Sylvia were having serious problems in their marriage. Things kept getting worse, and eventually, Sylvia decided she wanted out. She planned to file for divorce, and not just that, she wanted full custody of their two kids. This wasn't just talk anymore. She was already making moves. On June 9, 1994, everything fell apart. Edward was at work when his 7-year-old son, Kim, called and told him something that hit hard. Mom's going to file the divorce papers. Now Edward already knew things were bad. Sylvia had told him more than once that she planned to divorce him and take full custody of the kids. He never agreed to it, and he definitely didn't want that to happen. But hearing it come from his little boy, that made it real. It meant Sylvia was serious. After that call, Edward couldn't focus. His whole day at work was ruined. During his lunch break, he left the office and drove to a nearby store where he bought a machete. Then he went right back to work like nothing happened. But Edward wasn't done. When his shift ended, Edward drove home. But when he got there, the house was quiet. Sylvia and the kids still hadn't come home. Edward was waiting for his family to come back, quiet, angry, and ready to end it all. His mind was already made up. He grabbed the machete he'd bought earlier, along with a crowbar and some rope, and hid them in the bathroom, getting ready for what came next. That evening, when Sylvia and the kids came home, everything seemed normal from the outside. But inside, Edward was ready to snap. He was in their bedroom with Sylvia while their two kids sat in the living room, watching their favorite show, unaware of what was about to happen. Then, without warning, Edward attacked. He struck Sylvia multiple times with the crowbar, then used the rope to strangle her, all without making enough noise to alert the kids. With his wife dead, Edward turned his attention to the children. He called his son, Kim, into the bathroom, telling him it was time to brush his teeth. This was the same 7-year-old boy who had called him earlier that day, telling him about Sylvia's plans to file for divorce. When Kim walked in, Edward attacked him with the machete, striking him over and over. Then he called his 5-year-old daughter, Anna, into the bathroom, using the same routine. He didn't spare anyone, not even his own children. Afterward, Edward dragged Sylvia's body into the bathroom and used the machete again, mutilating her to make sure she was dead. Once it was over, Edward started cleaning up the house, but then stopped. He figured it didn't matter anymore. He had another plan. He packed a few bags, tossed them into his car, and drove straight to Orlando. From there, he caught a flight to Hawaii and began a new life under a fake name, Michael Green. Edward's home had grown unusually quiet. It was the summer of 1994, a time when most families on the block were busy with backyard barbecues, errands, or weekend plans. But over the span of a few days, no one had seen Sylvia Edward, a mother of 2, outside. Her children, Kim and Anna, hadn't been riding their bikes, playing in the yard, or visiting friends like they usually did. Not a single sound came from the house. Not a door creaking open, not a child laughing, not a car pulling in or out of the driveway. At first, neighbors didn't think much of it. Maybe the family was away. Maybe they were busy packing. After all, Sylvia had told a few close friends she was planning to leave Edward for good and take the kids with her. But when Edward Zakrzewski suddenly stopped showing up for work at Eglin Air Force Base, things escalated. No call, no excuse. He just vanished. His co-workers started to worry. Then people started calling Sylvia. Friends, co-workers, everyone tried to reach her, but no one got an answer. No returned calls, no messages, and no sign she'd made any travel plans. It became obvious. No one had heard from anyone in the Zakrzewski family for several days. The silence became too loud to ignore. On June 13, 1994, 4 days after the killings, the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office responded to a request for a welfare check at the Edward residence. Officers arrived at the tidy one-story home and knocked on the door. No answer. After confirming that no one had been seen entering or leaving for days, and with neighbors confirming they'd grown concerned, officers made the decision to enter the house. What they found was horrifying. Just inside the home, signs of a deliberate cleanup were immediately noticeable, but not enough to mask the unmistakable smell of death and decomposition. Blood evidence lingered, faintly wiped down but still visible in places like the hallway and bathroom. In the bathroom, officers found all 3 bodies, Sylvia, Kim, and Anna. Sylvia had been beaten and strangled. The heat had already started breaking her body down. Her injuries showed signs of a violent fight. Blood on the walls, broken items, nothing about it looked sudden or clean. Next to her were the kids, Kim and Anna. Both had been killed with a machete. Officers were shaken. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was a carefully planned execution of a wife and 2 innocent children. And the man responsible, Edward James Zakrzewski, was now missing. As the investigation unfolded, police discovered that after the killings on June 9th, Edward had taken time to clean up the crime scene, pack his belongings, and flee the area. The discovery of the bodies and the days of eerie silence that led up to it became one of the most disturbing chapters in the community's memory. A father, once viewed as quiet and intelligent, had destroyed his own family to avoid losing control. And the truth, for 4 long days, had been hidden behind a locked door and forced smiles in family photos that would now haunt headlines for years to come. While police were searching for Edward Zakrzewski and investigating the case, Edward, who had changed his name to Michael Green, was already living with the family of a minister running a religious commune in Hawaii. The minister didn't know Edward was a fugitive and let him stay in a small shack in exchange for doing maintenance work. Meanwhile, the police discovered the murders and charged Edward in absentia with killing his wife and kids after naming him the prime suspect, partly because he'd been recorded as AWOL from work. About 4 months later, the Zakrzewski family murders were featured on the American true crime show Unsolved Mysteries. Edward's face was shown, and authorities asked the public for help finding him. The night the episode aired, the minister noticed Edward looked just like the guy on TV, and he laughed it off. The next morning, October 15th, the minister and his family planned to confront Edward about his past. But by the time they woke up, Edward had already turned himself in to local police and admitted who he really was. On October 25th, 1994, Edward was sent back to Florida to face murder charges. In March 1996, just before his trial was set to begin, he confessed and pled guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder. But before everything unraveled, before the sentencing and the final execution, let's go back to where Edward met his wife Sylvia. Edward James Zakrzewski II was born on January 31st, 1965, in Kalamazoo, Michigan. A technical sergeant in the U.S. Air Force, Edward met his future wife, Pun Im, a beautiful South Korean woman, in 1986 while stationed in Montana. After Pun Im became pregnant, Edward married her, and she adopted the American name Sylvia. The couple went on to have 2 children, Edward III, known as Kim, and Anna. Between 1989 and 1992, Edward was stationed in South Korea for 3 years, before transferring to Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. The family then settled in Mary Esther, located in Okaloosa County. But despite the beginnings of a loving family, cracks had started to show. By June 9, 1994, their marriage was under serious strain. Sylvia planned to divorce Edward and take custody of their 2 children, intending to move back to South Korea with them. And that's when everything the family had built began to fall apart. In March 1996, during his sentencing hearing in Okaloosa County Circuit Court in Shalimar, Florida, Edward Zakrzewski claimed he wanted his family to die quickly and painlessly. He said he believed using a machete would kill them instantly without causing suffering. But according to the medical examiner, Sylvia's death was anything but quick or painless. She had still been alive when Edward strangled her. On March 31, 1996, the jury returned with their sentencing recommendation. They voted 7-5 in favor of the death penalty for the murders of Sylvia and their son, Kim. But for 5-year-old Anna, the vote was 6-6, which meant an automatic recommendation for life in prison. Before the final sentencing, Edward's attorney, Elton Killam, pleaded with the court to spare his client's life. Killam argued that Edward was under extreme emotional and mental stress at the time of the murders, and claimed that he had endured years of psychological abuse from Sylvia, who, according to the defense, had been unfaithful, gambled, and threatened to take the children back to her native Korea. Killam told the court that Edward's thinking had been deeply distorted, and that he believed he was showing mercy by preventing his children from a future of rejection and suffering in Korea as biracial outsiders. He acknowledged how bizarre and unimaginable the crime was, but asked the judge to show mercy and sentence Edward to life instead of death. But Assistant State Attorney Bobby Elmore didn't see it that way. He pushed hard for the death penalty in all 3 cases. Elmore called the killings brutal and emotionally devastating. He said the murder of Anna was especially heinous because she was the last to die and likely saw signs of what happened to her brother. He told the court that Edward's actions weren't merciful. They were cold and calculated and deserved the harshest punishment the law allowed. On April 19, 1996, Judge G. Robert Barron overruled the jury's recommendation of life for Anna's murder. He sentenced Edward to death for all 3 murders. In his final remarks, Judge Barron said that before killing Anna, Edward forced his daughter to endure the unimaginable fear of knowing what was coming and that her brother was already dead. He called it one of the most heinous and atrocious ways to die he had ever encountered in court. Edward filed appeals, but they were consistently denied. On June 12, 1998, the Florida Supreme Court upheld all 3 of his death sentences in a narrow 4-3 decision. The U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear his appeal on January 25, 1999. Over the years, Edward filed multiple post-conviction and federal appeals. The Florida Supreme Court rejected his post-conviction appeal in November 2003. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals denied relief in 2006 and again in 2009. By January 2016, Edward had spent 20 years on death row and had exhausted all available state and federal appeals. He was one of 141 Florida inmates in that position. In May 2017, he filed for resentencing, hoping to benefit from a legal reform that now required unanimous jury votes for death sentences in Florida. But the Florida Supreme Court rejected that request, stating that the change wasn't retroactive and that Edward's sentence had already been finalized by the U.S. Supreme Court back in 1999. Then, in 2023, public outrage erupted after Nicholas Cruz, the school shooter who killed 17 people in Parkland, avoided the death penalty due to a non-unanimous jury that led Florida lawmakers to change the law again. In 2023, Governor Ron DeSantis signed a bill allowing the death penalty to be imposed with a vote of at least 8 out of 12 jurors, no longer requiring unanimous consent. 2 years later, on July 1, 2025, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed Edward Zakrzewski's death warrant, scheduling his execution for July 31, 2025, at 6 p.m. at Florida State Prison in Rayford. Edward Zakrzewski woke up at 5 a.m. on the day of his execution. For his final meal, he ordered a heavy, Southern-style plate: fried pork chops, fried onions, potatoes, bacon, and toast. He washed it down with a root beer, followed by ice cream, a slice of pie, and a cup of coffee. He remained calm and cooperative throughout the process. When the curtain to the death chamber opened just after 6 p.m., Edward looked out and delivered his final words. "I want to thank the good people of the Sunshine State for killing me in the most cold, calculated, clean, humane, efficient way possible. I have no complaint." After the drugs were administered, Edward began breathing deeply. 3 corrections department staff in dark suits stood beside him. One of them shook him gently by the shoulders and called out his name. He didn't respond. Moments later, he was still. It's hard to process stories like this, when the person meant to protect a family becomes the reason they're gone. What part of this case hit you the hardest? And do you believe justice was finally served? Let us know in the comments below. If you want more real stories that uncover the darkest truths behind closed doors, make sure to subscribe to True Crime Cover.